Hi everyone, and welcome to the Chapter 10 lecture for medical terminology. This chapter is all about the nervous system, and the study of the nervous system is called neurology. Neuro meaning nerves, and ology being the study of. So the parts of the nervous system are the brain, the spinal cord, and then all of the nerves that basically shoot off of each of these and innervate all the parts of the body. So I've got to start off, of course, with my term of the day. I have two. And the first one is an eponym. It is named after a person, or place. And in this case, the person is a fictional character. And I tend to like eponyms that are named after fictional characters or mythological characters. But this one is called Alice in Wonderland syndrome. And it stems from Lewis Carroll's book Alice in Wonderland. There's a scene where after she falls down the rabbit hole, she sees a little door and she's too big to fit through it. So she drinks this little drink and it makes her shrink and she's really small and now she can fit through the door, but it's locked and the key is on the table that she can't reach anymore. And then this cake appears and she eats the cake and she grows really, really big. So it's like this scene with lots of shrinking and growing and size and proportion issues. So what Alice in Wonderland syndrome is a neurological condition or neurological symptom where your perception is off, your visual perception is off. So when you're looking at something, it appears really small or really large proportionally. It's very disproportionate. So I took a picture using my photo booth app on my camera to kind of show you what micropsia might look like, where somebody's head looks really shrunken on their body or maybe looks really large on their body. So this visual distortion of things looking too small, which would be micropsia, or too big, macropsia. And this could be associated with migraine headaches, or it could be from a tumor, or from taking hallucinogenic drugs. So there's all kinds of things that could potentially cause this condition, and it would be the neurologist's job to determine which is the cause. Another neat word is congenital analgesia. So congenital means born with, and analgesia is a condition without pain. Algo is a new combining form that means pain. So this is a condition where somebody is born without the ability to feel pain, which sounds kind of like a dream, but in fact pain is actually a very adaptive response. It tells us when our body tissues are injured and prevents us from further injuring them. I'm going to play this video for you about a little girl who has a very severe form of analgesia to show you how dangerous this condition actually can be, to not feel pain, even though it sounds like it would be nice.
First, none of us wants to feel pain, and we're especially protective when it comes to our children.
But what if your child couldn't feel any pain? That's a rare condition that so far has been diagnosed in only a handful of people. And as Juju Chang tells us, what sounds like a blessing turns out to be a curse.
In many ways, Gabby Gingras is a typical 7-year-old girl. She goes to gym class with other third graders, loves playing board games.
Okay, a miscellaneous 3.
And idolizes her older sister Katie. But in one very dangerous way, Gabby is not a typical little girl. She can't feel pain and is at constant risk of badly hurting herself. She's wearing a helmet and those goggles for a reason, but we'll get to that in a minute. This video was taken as part of a documentary called A Life Without Pain when Gabby was 4. Here she bangs into the sharp corner of a table, but just keeps on going. And see how unfazed she is when this dog collides with her? For the first 4 months of her life, Gabby was the perfect little baby. It wasn't until she started teething that her parents, Steve and Trish, noticed some odd behavior.
I was massaging Gabby's gums one day, and she bit down on me ungodly hard. And when I pulled my finger out of her mouth, I pulled the tooth out of her mouth. She's just happy playing like nothing happened.
It was as if she didn't even feel it, and that was just the beginning. The 4-month-old would teethe on anything, plastic toys, hardcover books, even her own fingers. until they were bloody.
She damaged them so badly. It really looked like raw hamburger. It was that chewed up and mangled.
She would also chew on her tongue like it was bubble gum.
It was bizarre and frightening. Steve and Trish brought Gabby to doctor after doctor. For months, specialists tested the baby for everything, from metabolic diseases to rare genetic disorders, and ruled out one disease after another.
Trish reached the frustration point, and she sat down on the computer and basically spent the whole weekend on the internet, searching and looking, and she found some pictures of kids with fingers that looked like Gabby's, just chewed up and mutilated. That was the first time we'd heard the term hereditary sensory autonomic neuropathy.
HSAN. It's an extremely rare genetic disorder that affects the sensory nerves. In Gabby, the nerve fibers that detect pain and temperature never developed. There is no cure. Imagine their tug of war trying to give Gabby a normal childhood,
Careful on the steps.
but wanting to protect her.
I'm the worst playground mom. Because I'm like, oh, don't climb that high, please. Oh, too fast.
Like most people, you've probably never heard of HSAN. Then again, maybe you saw it featured recently on Grey's Anatomy.
There. Can I go now?
That didn't even hurt.
The real-life Gabby is just as courageous.
How about your teeth? What happened to your teeth? Oh, I heard you have one tooth. Where is it? I don't see it. Where is it? Oh, I see it. It's on the top. And do you have a name for it? Toothy.
The Gingrasses, on their doctor's advice, had all of Gabby's baby teeth pulled to keep her from injuring herself. But that caused her adult teeth to grow in early, and Gabby knocked out all but one of those.
I'm thinking, here's my beautiful little girl. She's not going to have any teeth. People are going to make fun. They're going to think we're awful. Everything that goes through your mind.
The plan is to have dentures made when she's done growing. But what terrifies Gabby's parents the most is the fear that she could make herself blind.
Tell me about how the eye problem started. She had just turned 1. She woke up from a nap, and I thought, oh, there's a little bit of fuzz or fluff in her eye. It wasn't fuzz. There was a real mark on her cornea. So I quickly called the local doctor, and they were just stunned. He said, if you had this, you would be in such excruciating pain you couldn't open your eye.
Gabby's left eye was so badly damaged that her doctor literally stitched her eyelid shut in a desperate bid to save her vision.
Because she doesn't feel the pain of it, she ripped her own stitches out.
Steve came up with the idea of using swim goggles to protect Gabby's eyes. But it was already too late. She'd lost the vision in her left eye, and now it was at risk of developing into a life-threatening infection. The only solution was a drastic one. Remove the injured eye.
It just brings back those images of the hospital and letting her go on the gurney, and no parent should ever have to watch their child to death.
Today, Gabby has an artificial left eye.
You want to see how beautiful it looks?
I want to see my for a second.
She wears a protective contact lens over the right one, which is also damaged. For good measure, she uses safety glasses during the day and those swim goggles at night.
You all set?
Yeah.
Comfy?
Despite all these precautions, Gabby still manages to hurt herself constantly. Do kids like Gabby reach adulthood?
How old is that? 6 years old? Wow.
Can they have normal lives? Experts aren't even sure.
So this video was like 11 years ago. I'm just realizing that. So I'm kind of curious what has happened to Gabby since then. So any of you who are really interested, go ahead and look that up and get back to me, because that would be kind of fun to find out. Hopefully she's still kicking. All right, so the nervous system, back to it. The nervous system is divided into sort of 2 main parts, the central nervous system, or the CNS for short, and the peripheral nervous system, or the PNS for short. So we'll come back to this slide because this mostly has to do with the peripheral nervous system divisions, and we'll come back to that. But let's start with the central nervous system. The central nervous system is the brain and spinal cord. So the largest, this is the brain right here, all of it, and there are different parts. We'll talk about the cranium, the midbrain, or the brainstem, the midbrain area, and the cerebellum down here. The brain is in the head, in the cranial cavity, and it's surrounded by bone. The cranium, or the skull, is sort of the layman's term. And the largest part of the brain is the cerebrum here, this big wrinkly part on top, and it's divided into different lobes, and we'll learn the names of the different lobes. And then the brain is also surrounded by membranes that are fluid-filled, and these membranes are called the meninges, and there's 3 of them. So normally what we've seen with other vital organs like the lungs and the heart, they are surrounded by 2 membranes, a visceral and parietal membrane with some fluid in between. So the brain, also being an important vital organ, surrounded by membranes, fluid-filled, but there's actually 3 layers of meninges. So the cerebrum, I'm just going to keep moving my face around here. The cerebrum is the largest part of the brain. It's that wrinkly part, the part that you really think of as when you picture a brain in your head. And if we cut a section of the brain and we look at it, we would see that the tissue is sort of colored in 2 different colors. So the outer part, the outermost part, is what we call the gray matter, or the cortex, and the inner part is what we call the white matter, or the subcortex. And the reason for the different coloring has to do with the neurons, the structure of the neurons. So the neuron bodies, cell bodies, are found in the cortex, and the axons, which are like these long tails that happen to be coated in a fatty sheath made out of myelin, it's that fatty sheath that makes the white matter white. The folds that you see have names. So the outfoldings are called gyri, that would be plural, gyrus is singular, and the infoldings are called sulci, or sulcus for 1. The cerebrum is actually in 2 halves, a right half and a left half. So when we divide the body into halves, we refer to these 2 sides as the hemispheres, the right and left hemisphere of the brain. And those 2 hemispheres are connected by a band of tissue called the corpus callosum. And there it is up close. So it's the piece of tissue that actually connects the right and left halves of the brain so they can communicate with each other. This big gap, this chasm really between the 2, is called the anterior to posterior fissure because it goes front to back in the head. So here's the whole brain, and here's looking at a what would we be looking at here? A coronal or frontal section is what we're looking at here. This would be a sagittal section if we cut through somebody's nose and then pulled away their face and looked at their brain sort of sideways. So here we can see the cerebrum, we can see these folds. The creases are a crease is a sulcus and a fold is a gyrus. We can also see some of the ventricles of the brain. A ventricle is really just an open space that's full of fluid. So the heart has ventricles that are full of blood, and the brain has some ventricles that are full of cerebrospinal fluid. There's 4 ventricles in the brain, but you can only see really a couple of them here. Here we have this big thing right here. This is the corpus callosum. So in the previous slide it looks like it's this just small little patch, but it's actually like a long band that connects the right and left hemispheres. And then down here we have the thalamus and the hypothalamus, and here I think is the pituitary gland right here. This is the brainstem. And here is the cerebellum, which almost looks like a miniature brain underneath the cerebrum. So the right and left hemispheres of the brain have similar but slightly different functions. So they have the same, like opposite lobes, but there are different centers, processing centers on each side. So the right hemisphere is famous for things like being the home of spatial arrangement, so being able to like conceptualize things in 3 dimensions, recognize face patterns. And the left hemisphere is where a lot of the logic centers are. So for math, for memory, for speech. So sometimes you hear people say the right side of the brain is the artistic side and the left side is it's like the logical side. It's kind of an unfair generalization, but that's where it comes from. The lobes of the cerebrum are named after the bones under which they sit in the cranium. So the cranium, you have the frontal bone here, and then you have the parietal bones to the sides, and the temporal bones kind of over your ears, and then in the back of the head is the occipital bone. And so the lobes are also called the frontal lobe, the parietal lobes, the temporal lobes, and the occipital lobe. The frontal lobe is responsible for higher level thinking, for conscious thought and intelligence. So a lot of your critical reasoning skills come from the frontal lobe. Also helps us to produce speech. The parietal lobe, these 2 lobes, contain 2 sensory cortexes. So they are responsible for our sense of touch and the sense of taste. So somatosensory is literally a word that means having the function of sensing the body. And gustatory, gustato, means taste, sense of taste. So that's where your sense of taste is. The temporal lobe here in purple, the temporal lobes contain the olfactory cortex, so that's your sense of smell. Olfaction is smell. And the auditory cortex, which is your sense of hearing, which I feel like kind of makes sense because your nose and your ears are all sort of on the plane with that temporal lobe. And then lastly, in the back of the head, the occipital lobe is where the visual cortex is, which is why if you get really hit hard on the back of the head, you may lose your vision temporarily or even permanently, because that's where the visual cortex is. The thalamus and hypothalamus. The thalamus is located right here, right about dead center in the geography of the brain, and below it is the hypothalamus. Hypothalamus literally means below the thalamus. You don't really, for this class, need to know the functions of these parts, but you should know the location, and especially be able to recognize that hypothalamus means that it's located below the thalamus. So the thalamus is sort of like a relay station. So it receives signals from the body and then transmits them to the correct part of the brain, and vice versa. It gets information from different parts of the brain and then transmits them to the correct part of the body. The hypothalamus down here is it's important for regulating a lot of sort of daily survival skills. So it controls hunger, thirst, body temperature, circadian rhythm, sex drive, all the fundamentals of survival for life. Ventricles are fluid-filled chambers, and there are 4 different ventricles in the brain, and they're all pictured here. You don't need to know the names of the different ventricles. I just want you to know what a ventricle is, that it's fluid-filled. And the fluid that it's filled with is cerebrospinal fluid, or CSF. And cerebrospinal fluid is made by special cells that line these ventricle cavities, and they're called ependymal cells. So ependymal cells are really important. They actually make the cerebrospinal fluid that's basically like the juice that all of your nervous system is drinking, and it's a fluid that cushions them. It's important stuff. The brainstem here is highlighted and color-coded. You have the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla, which are the 3 parts of the brainstem. Again, they all have distinct roles. You don't need to know them for this class. The pons is another sort of relay station. It's the relay station of the brainstem, so it helps to transmit information to and from the thalamus. The medulla oblongata plays a big role in regulating a lot of vital functions, like your breathing rate and your heart rate. So the cerebellum, those different, the cerebellum. So that's the cerebrum. We talked about the cerebrum, the brainstem, and now the cerebellum, which is this little cauliflower looking thing back here. So the main role of the cerebellum is it plays a really big role in balance and coordination. There's some evidence that like ballerinas, that people who can, and like ice figure skaters who do a lot of spinning, that their cerebellums are more developed than somebody who doesn't, because they have to really work on, they've mastered their balance. This is from like a web episode that was reporting on an individual, I think it was like a 20-something-year-old Asian female, who was experiencing like dizziness and nausea and like dizzy spells. So she went to her doctor, went to a neurologist, and they did a brain scan to see what was going on. And they found that she didn't have a cerebellum. This big black thing right here is a hole where there is no cerebellum. So there are a handful of documented individuals who were born without a cerebellum and managed to survive without it. If you have a cerebellum, you can't like remove someone's cerebellum and do a cerebellumectomy and have them survive. That just can't happen. But apparently, if you're born without one, the rest of your brain can compensate, and you can actually live a very functional life with maybe just some balancing issues. I don't know what they did to fix that, by the way. I don't know how they fixed her dizzy spells. The meninges are those membranes that we talked about that surround the brain and the spinal cord and protect it, and then there's fluid there as well, cerebrospinal fluid. So there's 3 layers of the meninges. So this layer here is the bone of the cranium, the skull, and then here's the gray matter and white matter of the cerebellum, of the cerebrum. And here are the 3 meninges. So the outer layer is called the dura mater, and that is Latin for tough mother. So it's very thick, rigid, sort of cartilaginous, almost connective tissue. And then the inner layer here is called the pia mater. This is a very soft and delicate membrane that is really just the coating surface of the cerebrum, the brain tissue itself, and it's highly innervated. You can see all these, lots of vasculature, blood vessels flowing through it. And the middle layer is called the arachnoid layer, and that's because it has these little fibrous extensions that connect to the dura mater, the pia mater, and it looks kind of like spider webbing. And so arachno means spiders because it's got that spider webbing sticking off of it. And it's between the pia mater and the arachnoid layer that you have the cerebrospinal fluid, the fluid layer. So these meninges, they help to protect the brain from trauma, from shaking around in the head. When you shake your head, it provides cushioning so your brain doesn't slam up against the cranium, though it still can. That's why you don't want to shake the baby. You can basically brain damage them. And the meninges also, that cerebrospinal fluid also helps to nourish the brain as well. There's some nourishment gotten from the cerebrospinal fluid. The spinal cord is the other part of the central nervous system in addition to the brain, and it's a long, narrow column of nerve bundles that extend down the length of the back. And they are protected on all sides by the spinal column, the vertebrae. So here's a single vertebral bone. So this is the body. It's like the main mass of the vertebra. And then you can see there's sort of this hole created, and then these several bony processes that stick off. And so the spinal cord runs down this hole, the central tube, down the spine. So it's surrounded on all sides by bone and protected from damage that way. The spinal cord also consists of gray matter and white matter, though it's inversed. So the gray matter is on the inside and the white matter is on the outside of the spinal cord. The spinal cord is also covered by the same 3 meninges layers and surrounded in cerebrospinal fluid, which is that blue fluid here, right? This yellow fluid is called the epidural fluid, and the space that it fills is called the epidural space. Epidura, so it's above or outside of the dura, as in the dura mater, the outer layer of the meninges, so it's outside of the meninges. So when somebody has epidural anesthesia, like during labor, All right, they insert a tube, a flexible tube here into that epidural space and basically drip pain medication there. Another form of anesthesia is spinal anesthesia or spinal tap, where they actually inject the medication into the cerebrospinal fluid, so they get really close to the spinal cord there. The base of the spinal cord is in the lower back in the lumbar region, and it's basically like, it's just like a long ponytail, and where the hairs are really nerves. And so at the base of a ponytail, you have the ends of the hairs. So at the base of the spinal cord, you have the ends of the nerves. And since it kind of looks like a ponytail, it's called a cauda equina, which is basically Latin for ponytail. Literally a horse's tail. Equine is horse. And cauda is tail, which we learned in the first chapter when we talked about moving in a caudal position towards the tailbone. So that's the central nervous system, the brain and the spinal cord. Now for the peripheral nervous system, which is basically all the nerves that shoot off out of the brain and off the spinal cord. So the cranial nerves, there's 12 pairs, and they are all in the head, and they receive sensory information or send motor controls out to different parts of the head for the most part. So all of them are named really based on their function. So although I'm not going to ask you to memorize these 12 different cranial nerves, I might ask you what some of their functions are, because you should be able to tell just by the term, the medical term. So for example, the olfactory nerve. Olfactory means having the function of smelling. So from medical terminology alone, you should know that that has the function of smelling. Oculomotor, having the function of moving the eyes, literally is what you would translate that to. Glossopharyngeal, pertaining to the tongue and throat. So this one tells you like where it is, and it would be logical that it would play a role in something like taste or speech, moving the tongue, or swallowing, because it's involved in controlling the tongue and the throat. My favorite one, though, is the vagus nerve. Vago is a combining form that means wandering. So the vagus nerve is the only one that actually leaves the head, and it travels from the cranium down into the chest and actually helps to regulate some of your vital functions like your breathing rate and your heart rate and your digestion. And it is one of the reasons why if somebody is paralyzed from the neck down, they can still breathe, they're still alive, because that vagus nerve still is innervating some of those vital functions. The spinal nerves all branch off the spinal cord as it goes down the back. There are 31 pairs of spinal nerves, and they can also have sensory function or motor function. So sensory info comes in through the nerves, and it enters the spinal cord through the back side. So the dorsal nerve roots pick up that sensory information. The ventral nerve roots on the front side send out motor commands. So those two commands are traveling sort of on highways in different directions. Motor commands come from the brain down to the muscle, and sensory commands come from the body up to the brain. And so they can travel through these different entrances and exits, if you will. So here's the nerve that's traveling up to the brain, all right? If it's sending a motor command, all right, it sends it through the ventral nerves and the dorsal, and any sensory information comes through the dorsal nerve root back here in the back side, the posterior side. And here's a nice picture too where you can see those 3 meninges layers covering the spinal cord, the pia mater, the arachnoid layer with the cerebrospinal fluid in it, and the dura mater, so the same 3 layers that are around the brain. In addition to so the cells that make up the nervous system, most of them are neurons. The parenchyma, or functional part of the nervous system, are the neurons. They are the ones that actually transmit signals, and they have a special sort of structure. This is what a neuron looks like, the anatomy of a neuron. It has a cell body, and then it has these branches that come off of it that are called dendrites. Dendrite literally means tree branch. And then it has this long tail called an axon. And it's at the ends of the axons that it connects with other neurons, with the dendrites of other neurons. That axon, because it's so long and thin, it is insulated by these fatty sheaths called they're made of fat called myelin. So these are the myelin sheaths. Just like a wire, like your charging cord for your computer or your phone is covered in plastic, so you don't A, electrocute yourself, but B, so that the electricity flows cleanly through that wire. All right, it insulates that electric flow. So your neurons actually transmit electricity as well. So that the myelin sheaths work very much like the plastic coating on a wire. It insulates and helps to transmit those signals much more cleanly, and also prevents damage to the neuron itself, just like the plastic prevents damage to the wires. The chemical signals that neurons use to transmit signals are called neurotransmitters, and they're cartooned here in these little red balls. And there's lots of different types of neurotransmitters. In human biology or anatomy physiology, you might be responsible for learning the different types of neurotransmitters, but we will not cover those in this class. So in addition to those neurons that transmit nerve signals, there's also several sort of helper cells in the nervous system. We call these neuroglia, or the support cells. Glia are cells that provide support. So some of the neuroglial cells are things like astrocytes. Astro is star, it means star-shaped. So astrocytes are literally star-shaped cells. And these are really like the macrophages of the nervous system. So they're immune cells that are there to patrol and make sure no pathogens get in, and they can eat debris. So they're phagocytes. They're cells that can eat things. The ependymal cells, we said, are the ones that line the ventricles and make cerebrospinal fluid, so they're really important. I think the Schwann cells also play a role in that, and Schwann is an eponym. It's named after whoever discovered them. Oh, the astrocytes. My bad. Astrocytes are not the macrophages. Microglia. Microglia are the macrophages of the nervous system. They are the ones that can phagocytose, engulf dead cells and pathogens. Astrocytes help to maintain the blood-brain barrier, so they help to keep those blood vessels really tightly shut so that chemicals and pathogens can't get past in the first place. So those are some of the neuroglia, the support cells that are not involved in direct transmission of nerve signals, but support the neurons. Schwann cells help to make those myelin sheaths actually as well. So now for the peripheral nervous, a little bit more about the peripheral nervous system. So the cranial nerves and the spinal nerves, we said, are part of the peripheral nervous system. And the peripheral nervous system has sort of two modes. So there's the somatic nervous system, and this is the one that we have voluntary control over. So all of our skeletal muscles are controlled by the somatic nervous system. The autonomic nervous system, I think autonomic sounds a lot like automatic, and these are all the things that we have involuntary control over. So our brain is controlling our breathing rate. You're not thinking about breathing, you just do it. Your heartbeat, your contractions of your heart, that's not something you voluntarily, you don't think, you're not pumping your heart the way you pump your muscles when you're doing bicep curls. So the autonomic nervous system is one that's operating subconsciously, it's involuntary and automatic. It's the somatic nervous system that controls voluntary movements when we want to move something. So this autonomic nervous system, the one that responds involuntarily, it has sort of two different modes. So there's the rest mode and the stress mode. So the parasympathetic division controls everything and regulates everything when the body is at rest or at peace. So like right now, I'm relaxed, I'm sitting in a chair, I'm in my office, I'm secure, and So my parasympathetic division is active. My heart rate is low, my breathing rate is low, my digestive system is actively digesting my lunch. All right, but if like a tiger were to bust into my office right now, all right, that would turn on my sympathetic division. So I say parasympathetic, P for peace and S for stress. So when you're under stress, your body automatically ramps up your heart rate, ramps up your breathing rate, starts to shut down digestion, which is why sometimes when people are so scared, they poop themselves, okay? That the stress mode, the sympathetic division, is really designed for that fight or flight response. When you are threatened, you need to either run away as fast as you can or fight as hard as you can. And so your body turns on all of these involuntary responses to help you respond that way so you can survive. The downside of being human is that we are one of very few creatures that actually experience psychosocial stress. So a lot of animals, really just the stressors that they encounter are things like predators or starvation, environmental stresses, whereas we stress things like I have a test tomorrow, or I'm worried about catching the coronavirus. So these are psychological stresses and stressors, and they can stimulate the sympathetic division more chronically or long term. And these sympathetic activities, the increased heart rate, the increased breathing rate, those are really meant to be short-term responses, and your body's not cut out to run them in a long-term capacity. And so that's why we end up with things like cardiovascular disease from excessive stress, because basically our sympathetic nervous system is turned on too much or too chronically. And so reducing that, keeping that down, you want to activate your parasympathetic division over your sympathetic division. So for some diseases and conditions of the nervous system, starting with the central nervous system, the brain. So amnesia literally means a condition without memory. M-N-E, mne, is a combining form that means memory. It's also the start of the word mnemonic. A mnemonic device is something that helps you remember. So amnesia is loss of memory. Anencephaly is a condition without the brain. This is a congenital condition that babies are sometimes born with parts of their brain missing, and a lot of times this is due to nutritional deficiency. Folate deficiency can cause anencephaly. I think Zika virus can even contribute to it. Zika virus causes usually microcephaly, but it can result in anencephaly. Microcephaly would be a small brain. Anencephaly is actually missing parts of the brain. I think that being born without a cerebellum would be a form of anencephaly. Usually it's not survivable. Babies that are born with anencephaly are often stillborn, or they live for just a few hours or a few days maybe. And if they do live beyond that, it's with a lot of, they need a lot of support. Aphasia is a condition without speech, where you lose speech. Either you lose the ability to produce speech or to understand speech. This can happen after a stroke. Dysphagia is difficulty speaking. A stutter would be a type of dysphagia. Not to be confused with dysphagia with a G. Phago is to eat or swallow. That's a problem with the digestive system. And dysphasia with an S is having to do with speech. Other conditions of the brain. So I said a stroke. Aphasia can be, and dysphagia can be results of a stroke. The medical term for stroke is a cerebrovascular accident, or a CVA. So you'll often, although doctors will probably use the term stroke when communicating with patients, they will often chart it as a CVA, because that is the medical term. And that's what it is. It's an accident that happens in the brain, either a clot that blocks blood flow to the brain, or an aneurysm that ruptures accidentally, causing a lack of blood flow to the brain because it's spilling out everywhere and hemorrhaging. And it's in the vasculature the blood vessels that feed the cerebrum. So a cerebrovascular accident, that's what a stroke is. It's a blockage of blood flow to the cerebrum, and depending on how much blood is blocked, if it's a large artery, then somebody could die very quickly from a stroke. If it's a smaller artery, they may show signs of a stroke, and you can get them to the hospital and they can be treated with minimal side effects, and then everything in between. An AVM, an arteriovenous malformation, can happen actually anywhere in the body. This technically would be a cardiovascular condition. It's a bad formation of the arteries or veins in an organ. And so it's basically like a mesh, just really poorly formed arteries that can rupture very easily. They're more prone to rupturing. And so if this is discovered, if somebody is discovered as having an AVM in a critical organ, it's something that doctors usually want to address and want to surgically remove or keep an close eye on because of its ability to rupture and lead to stroke if it's in the brain, or heart attack if it's in the heart, etc. So some of the side effects of a stroke are that it can result in either weakness of one side of the body or paralysis of one side of the body, either permanently or temporarily. And that's because a stroke usually happens on one side of the brain. So what I didn't mention earlier is that your brain is divided into right and left halves, but in the base of the spine, when the spinal cord is exiting the brain, there's a crossover of the wiring. And so the right side of the brain actually is controlled by the right side of the brain controls the left side of the body, and the left side of the brain controls the right side of the body. So if you have a stroke or a CVA on the left side of the brain, it can result in hemiparesis, weakness, or hemiparalysis, loss of sensation, on the right side of the body. So this is also just showing you this picture here. Here's an artery in the brain, and the way that you could have a stroke is either that artery ruptures, like an aneurysm ruptures and you get hemorrhaging, or you could have a blood clot, an embolus, that blocks the blood flow, and either way it leads to starvation of that near surrounding tissue from oxygen, and the brain needs oxygen. There's also several different types of tumors of the brain, both benign and cancerous, and they have different names depending on which cell type they arise from. So this one is a glioma that's pictured here, but there's also astrocytoma, neuroma, or schwannoma. So there's different types of brain tumors, some benign and some cancerous. So the benign ones can still be problematic because they can grow to a size that leads to discomfort, pain, headaches, and they may need to be removed, and they may or may not be removable depending on their location. And then cancerous ones are a problem because they are actively growing and spreading, and so those are definitely more emergent. Other conditions of the brain. Coma is a term for a deep state of unconsciousness. A concussion is really a bruise to the brain. It's a contusion of the brain. The brain is actually really soft. If you've ever seen a preserved brain, they are treated with fixative agents, and so they're pretty solid. But an actual brain inside your head is really more the consistency of jello. It's very jiggly, it's very soft. So if you fall and hit your head really hard, you can basically bump your brain up against the cranium real hard and bruise your brain. So concussions can be dangerous. They literally can cause brain damage. Another really dangerous side effect of a concussion is it could lead to bleeding in the meninges, which is called and that can lead to a subdural hematoma, a tumor of blood underneath the dura. And the brain fits very tightly in the cranium. There's not a lot of extra space up here. So if the brain swells, or if there's a blood blister basically growing in your cranium, that puts a lot of pressure on the brain and can be deadly. So the treatment actually for a subdural hematoma or brain swelling of any kind, actually, can be to have something called a craniotomy, where they literally just remove they just remove the skull, a big hole from the skull, and let your brain swell. And then when the brain swelling comes down, they put the piece of skull back on, because the brain, if it swells within the cranium and doesn't have enough space, it'll basically suffocate. Which is kind of crazy that we have that ability to just like, oh, just take off a piece of somebody's skull and let their brain swell for a little bit. Syncope is the medical term for fainting, and this is used very often in healthcare. When I was in for delivery, I have vasovagal syncope, which means basically the sight of blood and needles sometimes makes me faint. And so when I was in for delivery, they had to monitor me closely whenever there were needles involved, because they kept mentioning my syncopal episodes, that I have a tendency to have syncopal episodes. So you do hear that term used a lot, syncope. Cephalalgia is the medical term for a headache. Algo is pain, algia, a condition of pain, and cephalo is head. So technically the medical term for a headache is cephalalgia. A migraine would be a particularly severe form of cephalalgia. Some other diseases and conditions affecting the brain. Dyslexia, it means condition of difficulty reading or writing. And so this is a perception issue, having trouble spelling words correctly, like letters on the page look backwards or look mixed around, which can make it difficult to read and write properly. Down syndrome is a genetic disease. It's caused by having 3 copies of chromosome 21. Humans have 23 pairs of chromosomes, so sets of 2. But if you have 3 sets of chromosome 21, that's a condition called Down syndrome. It's a fairly common genetic disorder, and it does result in various cognitive and neurological issues that range along a spectrum. Some degenerative diseases of the brain. Dementia is literally a condition without or that reverses the mind. So it's a condition of losing the mind. And that can happen just like old senility, like people going senile. They just start to lose parts of their memory or lose the ability to do certain things cognitively. Alzheimer's disease is a specific form of dementia that's particularly severe and also has a strong hereditary component. Huntington's chorea and Parkinson's disease are also hereditary diseases that result in degeneration of motor neurons, and so they can lead to things like spasms, but Huntington's also involves dementia, so it's dementia and spasms. Parkinson's is more physical and then cognitive, but all of them are degenerative diseases of the nervous system. So I have a picture here of Muhammad Ali and Michael J. Fox. They are 2 celebrities who have Parkinson's disease and are very active what's the word? They're very vocal and active supporters of research for Parkinson's disease. They're outspoken advocates for Parkinson's disease. Some other degenerative diseases of the nervous system that affect the motor neurons more is amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, or ALS for short. Also referred to as Lou Gehrig's disease. Lou Gehrig was a famous baseball player who had this disease, and it's named after him. And multiple sclerosis, or MS. Now, both of these diseases, they're kind of similar in their presentation. They develop later in life, or I mean, not even, some people can develop it as early as like late teens, early 20s, but it's not something that is congenital. You're not born with it, and I don't know any kids who have developed these diseases. Multiple sclerosis is due to an autoimmune condition, so the treatment for the disease is different because the cause is different, but both of them result in the erosion of neurons and they can happen either, they can progress very quickly or they can progress very slowly. And they're not, neither of them are very well understood. They're not hereditary, they're not genetic. So they are diagnosed based on symptoms of starting to like lose sensations or have weird muscle spasms or pain in the muscles that is chronic and not explained by other things. Some other conditions. Epilepsy. Epilepsy is a condition of seizures. Epsi means seizures, and so this is a condition. What a seizure is basically it's misfiring of the neurons. I think of it as kind of like fibrillation of the heart. So when the heart normally contracts like this, and then when it's fibrillating, it's kind of having a spasm. So same thing, when the neurons firing in the brain stop doing it in like a coordinated way and just kind of spasm and misfire, it can lead to these convulsions or these seizures. Now, seizures aren't always violent convulsions, so when we see them in the media or think about them, we usually think about them as being someone on the floor having spasms, shaking, maybe foaming at the mouth. All right, that is a grand mal seizure, also known as a tonic-clonic seizure, because it involves a lot of muscle tonicity or tightening. And these are the minority of seizures. Another type of seizure that's less well known and often not diagnosed because it can be so subtle are what are called the petit mal seizures or absence seizures. And I had a friend in college who her cousin had these, and he came to visit, and we were out like at a restaurant having dinner, and I was sitting across from him talking, and we're talking, and then all of a sudden his eyes kind of rolled up, and he just looked like he was just thinking or just staring off into space, like he had just kind of like fallen asleep with his eyes open. And then like after about 20 seconds he kind of looked back at me and was kind of disoriented, and that was an absence seizure. So absence seizures can be very subtle. There's no shaking involved. It's usually just almost like a loss of awareness, but you don't fall over. It's almost like a conscious blackout. And so these can kind of go undiagnosed because a lot of times parents, especially if kids are having them, parents just think, oh, their kid's like spacing out, they have ADD, but actually sometimes it's these petit mal seizures. So both are due to these misfirings in the brain. After a seizure, it's very normal to have a period of disorientation, but also, especially after a grand mal seizure, that the few minutes after the seizure can involve different like characteristic or personality changes in the person. They can often be very aggravated or agitated, mean and snappy and angry, or violent even. So that post-ictal period is an important one that the patient still needs support, and you still need to keep an eye on them. If you're a Grey's Anatomy fan, there was a very dramatic episode of someone having a post-ictal aggressive episode at Meredith Grey that was incredibly violent. Narcolepsy is also a type of seizure disorder where you are seized by sleep. So narco means sleep. Narcotics are sleep-inducing drugs. So narcolepsy is where people just kind of unexpectedly fall asleep in the middle of doing something else. They just fall asleep, shut down. Meningitis, encephalitis, and neuritis are all itises. So inflammation or infection of different parts of the brain. Meningitis is infection or inflammation of the meninges, the membranes that surround the brain. Encephalitis is inflammation of the brain itself. And neuritis would be inflammation of a nerve. So this could be any nerve in the body. I have some pain in my wrist right now, but I'm not sure if it's like a tendon or a nerve. So it might be neuritis. I don't know. Some congenital conditions. I'm going to move my face. Cerebral palsy or cerebral palsy, CP for short, is a congenital condition that can be due to a lack of oxygen to the brain either in utero during development or sometimes occurs during labor, in the process of labor, a lack of, lack of oxygen that can cause this. It basically causes brain damage that affects the muscles primarily. Can affect the muscles of speech, but also the skeletal muscles. So people with cerebral palsy often have spasms or tics. It very rarely affects cognitive ability, though. So people with cerebral palsy are very intelligent, but sometimes, due to their physical disabilities, are treated as if they're not. Hydrocephalus is a condition of water in the brain. That's literally what it means, water in the head. It's a buildup of cerebrospinal fluid that can happen in utero and can put pressure on the brain and damage the brain as well. A neural tube defect is what's pictured here. This is called spina bifida or meningeocele, and this can happen from folate deficiency during pregnancy. It can lead to basically a herniation of the spinal cord from the back, and it has to be surgically fixed. You have to very carefully deliver these babies and then do surgery carefully to fix them. It's very difficult to do it without any damage to the spinal cord. So a lot of times babies who are born with meningocele, they may have some damage to the spinal cord and have difficulty walking, and have different, some paresis or paralysis below that point in their spine, basically. Another kind of nerve disorder, a generalized nerve disorder, would be called a radiculopathy. So radiculo and rhizo are both terms for the nerve root at the, like sort of the cauda equina at the base of the spine. And so radiculopathies are diseases of the spinal nerve root. So usually pinching of nerves in that area. So a common one is often referred to as sciatica. The sciatic nerve runs from the hip down the leg. And so if it's being pinched due to like shifting of bones, in pregnancy, a lot of women in pregnancy experience this, where the weight of the fetus pushes on that sciatic nerve and you get this shooting pain down your butt and your leg. And also elderly people, as we get older and our spine starts to shift a little bit, spinal shifts can pinch on that nerve and cause chronic pain. And that's a type of radiculopathy. Spinal cord injuries can result in paralysis from that point in the spine downwards, or everything inferior to that. So if somebody has a trauma to their spinal cord, sort of in the lumbar region or the abdominal region, the paralysis is just of the lower part of the body. So we call that paraplegia, as in like a pair of limbs are paralyzed. But if you have trauma to the cervical region and the neck of the spinal cord, then that can result in quadriplegia, or loss of sensation to all four limbs, arms and legs. And that the abbreviation that's commonly used for spinal cord injury is SCI. And spinal cord injuries, sometimes they can resolve. So initially you may have a patient who's showing signs of paraplegia because the swelling in their spinal cord is so bad. But once the swelling goes down, they sometimes regain that sensation and regain that functionality. But if the spinal cord is actually cut or severed and not able to heal, then that is a permanent condition. There are various different neuropathies of the nerves, things that can, so if you have pain, if you have inflammation, if you have neuritis, you may also have pain. Neuralgia is pain in a nerve. Anesthesia is a condition without sensation. We usually think of anesthesia as being a form of medicine that's given to someone, but basically if you have a loss of sensation or numbness, that would be charted as anesthesia, loss of sensation. Paresthesia is that tingling sensation that you get, like when your feet fall asleep or your arm falls asleep, and then it's that pins and needles feeling. All right, that's called paresthesia. And it's normal if you are sitting on your foot and then you get up and you realize you've cut off the blood flow to your foot. But it's not normal if you are just going about your daily business and you're constantly losing sensation in your right arm. That would not be good. Hyperesthesia is a sensation of of sort of a heightened sensation. So you become very sensitive to touch or smell or various sensations. They are intensified. And synesthesia is a really trippy, weird kind of condition. So this is one that is not, it's thought to be sort of like a permanent, like some people have it and some people don't. Most people don't. But people who have synesthesia have some kind of crossing of the wires in their sensory cortexes, because they can do that. They claim things like being able to hear colors or taste sounds or smell a touch, or something. Like their senses are mixed. And there have been a handful of famous artists that they thought had synesthesia. They think that synesthesia may be related to creativity or creative, artistic outlets. People who have this different creative view because of this different sort of perception of the world that they have, literally, because they can do things like taste color. And then here are some different diagnostic procedures to diagnose neurological conditions. You can do a cerebral angiography, which is pictured over here. So cerebral meaning pertaining to the brain, and angiography to take a recording of the blood vessels in the brain. So basically they inject a dye into the carotid artery or somewhere in the artery. This is the carotid artery bringing blood up the neck into the head and then into the cerebrovasculature. Okay, so you can see, you could look for something like an AVM, an arteriovenous malformation, or a blood clot, or an aneurysm by doing this. A CT scan is basically it's like taking multiple x-rays and then putting them together to get a three-dimensional image. An MRI, magnetic resonance imaging, uses magnets to obtain an image that's kind of similar to a CAT scan, just doesn't use anything radioactive. And positron emission tomography, or a PET scan, is relatively new, and this uses radioactive material to look at function. So you can see different parts of the brain light up when they become active, or you can look for tumors, which would be really hot spots on a PET scan. Some procedures that can be done. A lumbar puncture is also known as a spinal tap. This is done to either deliver like anesthesia to the spine, but also can be used to sample cerebrospinal fluid if somebody is suspected of having something like meningitis. They might want to get a sample of spinal fluid to look for bacteria. So that's called a lumbar puncture, because you're puncturing the lower spine, and it requires a very skilled anesthesiologist, because if that needle punctures the spinal cord, that can cause serious damage. So they're going in blind. They can't see. They have to feel for it. If you have a hydrocephalus, fluid in the brain, or if you had a brain tumor removed, and after the tumor is removed, you get a lot of inflammation and inflammatory fluid in the brain, they may insert a VP shunt, which stands for ventriculoperitoneal. So it goes from the ventricles of the brain down into the peritoneum. So it's just like a long tube. It's under the skin here, and it extends down into the peritoneal cavity of the abdomen, where excess fluid can be absorbed into the intestines and excreted, and so that it doesn't build up in the brain. I had a friend, actually my high school sweetheart, who in 9th grade he had a brain tumor removed and he had a VP shunt put in, and that was before his growth spurt. So then like around 10th or 11th grade he hit a growth spurt, and he started having these terrible migraines that put him in the hospital, because he just couldn't, he would be like vomiting and he like couldn't open his eyes. He was in so much pain. And it turned out that when he had his growth spurt, that this the VP shunt shifted a little bit, and was agitating him and leading to these migraines. So they ended up just removing it because it was ready to come out anyway. It had been like 3 or 4 years since the tumor had been removed. So the VP shunt is not necessarily permanent. It's usually removed later, especially if it becomes problematic. A craniotomy is a procedure to cut open the cranium that we talked about before if you have brain swelling. And they can cut open the cranium, basically leave it open for the brain to have room to swell, and then put the cranium back on, like a hat. And then lastly, some drug categories. Analgesics are things that treat pain. So Tylenol, ibuprofen, these are all what we call NSAIDs, non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs. They are all analgesics. If you look at Tylenol, if you look at the bottle, the ingredients, it says the active ingredient is acetaminophen or paracetamol if you're in Canada or the UK or Australia. And it'll say that its function is that it's an analgesic. And also it's an antipyretic, it's anti-fever. So narcotics are prescription level analgesics, which also have a tendency to be addictive and are prescribed much less now due to problems with people becoming addicted after taking them for medical purposes and then becoming dependent on them. Anti-epileptic or anticonvulsant drugs would be given to someone who experienced seizures, had epilepsy. And that's the end of Chapter 10. See you next time.